So my remarks this morning are entitled, Are We Bound by Our Stories? And I want to follow up. This is a follow-up to what we talked about Saturday morning on not good enough. And I want to get a little dig a little deeper into this whole notion that we talked about on Saturday and look at our stories from a slightly different perspective than we talked about on Saturday. You know, when we talk about seeing things clearly, without distortion, without delusion, we're talking about a really important means of reducing our suffering. And this includes how we see ourselves, a topic that I addressed on Saturday in terms of stories. And the stories we tell ourselves are usually fixed and recurring, which really is contrary to the Buddhist teaching on non-self. In other words, the stories we tell ourselves are usually deeply rooted, long-standing, and they tend to be fixed and recurring. And in Buddhism, the concept of stories and narratives that we tell ourselves is really deeply intertwined with his fundamental teachings on the nature of self and the nature of suffering and the path to freedom and liberation. So, from a Buddhist perspective, our stories and our sense of self are intricately connected, and they often serve as the very chains that bind us to our suffering. So, let me flesh that out a little bit. But just suffice to say that through wisdom and practice, we have the potential to limit and free. I'm sorry, to free ourselves from the limiting narratives that we cling to. And one of the central tenets, and we've talked about here of Buddhism, one of the three characteristics of existence is the anatta or non-self. The Buddha taught that that what we conventionally refer to as the self with a capital S is in fact a constantly changing collection of physical and mental phenomena with no fixed and no permanent and no independent existence. It's always flowing, always changing. So if it's not fixed, how can it always be not good enough? That's the fundamental question. Because not good enough implies a fixed, recurring self-perception. And I find this teaching incredibly liberating for that reason, because the whole teaching on not self is contrary to this notion that we talked about on Saturday of not good enough. You know, our sense of a solid, separate self is just another story we tell ourselves and become attached to, just like the not good enough stories that we talked about on Saturday. We construct an identity, what we think is a fixed identity, around our experiences, our memories, our thoughts, our beliefs, and we sort of weave them into a whole cloth. We weave them into a coherent narrative. But Buddhism asserts that this self, this narrative, this self story is fundamentally a kind of delusion, a misperception of reality that leads to suffering. In other words, by clinging to this story of a fixed self, we create this artificial duality between self and other. You know, an I that needs to be protected and promoted and really is always in conflict or competition with you. You know, this is the ego at work. And again, you know, I always say the ego is not a bad thing. We just have to manage it skillfully. You know, often we become attached to experiences. This is so-called confirmation bias, attached to experiences that affirm and enhance our self-story. And we push away experiences that contradict or threaten our story of who we are. Okay, this attachment to either the good parts or the aversion to the not so good parts are at the very roots of our suffering. You know, moreover, our stories about ourselves, they tend to be narrow, they tend to be limiting for the reasons that I talked about on Saturday. We define ourselves based on past actions, relationships, our past successes, and our past failures. And typically, these are stories that we begin to internalize from our parents, from our siblings, from our peers when we were children. So we end up believing ourselves to be a particular kind of person. I'm a good person. I'm a bad person. I'm a success. I'm a failure. I'm worthy. I'm not worthy of love. And these fixed narratives blind us to the more open, spacious, and ever changing reality of who we are. We're just even moment to moment not the same person. There is a core there, yes, but how much do our stories trap us into this narrative? It restricts our sense of possibility. It traps us in these cycles of thought and behavior which are repetitive and well worn. And this path is one of waking up from those stories, waking up from the dream and the delusion of these stories and seeing through this illusion of self, fixed self. So through our practice, as I said on Saturday, we learn to observe the stories as they arise without getting caught in them, without getting hooked in them, without believing them, and most importantly, without identifying with them. We don't make them me. We don't make them, this is who I am, this fixed story. We see them for their constructed nature and how they're conditioned by countless factors in the course of our lives outside of our control and often mostly outside of our awareness. But with the practice, we gradually disidentify with these narratives. We touch into a deeper dimension of ourselves. We become the observer of our experience. And as we let go of these limiting self stories and they limit us, they put us in a box, we open to greater wisdom and compassion. And we see that all beings are subject to these same forces of conditioning, that everyone gets caught up in their own narratives of who they are, their own self story. And recognizing that we're doing that is the root of compassion because it helps us see that everybody is struggling. It is the root of compassion. And at the same time as we do it, we really tap into this sort of fundamental freedom, this freedom of the mind, which is a capacity to be open, to be present, and to responsive to life as it unfolds beyond the constraints of our stories. In other words, we're not prisoner of our stories. And ultimately, from a Buddhist view, we're not inherently bound by those stories. They have no substantial reality, no more than any other fleeting thoughts or any other constructions of the mind. But we are bound by them to the extent that we believe in them, cling to them, and identify with them. But in reality, we are not bound by our stories. So the path of awakening in Buddhism is one of seeing through the stories. First of all, recognizing them, noticing them, letting them go, and aligning ourselves with a deeper reality of interconnectedness and constant change. And in this way, we taste freedom. That's the promise that the Buddha offered. Let go of the stories, taste freedom, see ourselves not as fixed in, not bound by our stories, as I said at the beginning.